Hi, I'm Mike Licona, and today we're going to be talking about the text of the New Testament. All ancient literature has come to us today via ancient texts and manuscripts of different sorts. Let's take a look at what we have behind the New Testament. For one, the New Testament was written in Greek. That was the original language. So the first thing we want to look at are the number of Greek manuscripts that have come down to us. As of September 2013, we have approximately 5,838 manuscripts. Now, when I was in grad school back in the 1980s, there were approximately 5,300. So they've discovered about 500 manuscripts since then. 5,838 Greek manuscripts. Now, there are also more than 25,000 manuscripts, ancient manuscripts that appear in other languages, such as Syriac, Ethiopic, Coptic, Latin, etc. These aren't as valuable, of course, as the Greek manuscripts, which reflect the original language, but they still provide us with other attestation to what we have for the New Testament literature. In addition, we have more than 1 million quotations from the early church fathers that give us where they're quoting or alluding to portions of the New Testament text. Now, these would have even less value than manuscripts of ancient translations of the Greek text, but they still provide text of the New Testament for us. Not all manuscripts are of the same size. So, for example, this is the John Rylands papyrus number P52. And this is actually about the size of a credit card. This, at present, is the oldest known manuscript of the New Testament that we have. It's a fragment of the Gospel of John. And again, it's about the size of a credit card. Now, some manuscripts are a lot larger, but the average size of a Greek manuscript is about 459 pages. 459 pages. Moreover, the number of Greek manuscripts that we have within the first 1,000 years of Christianity are nearly 600. And this oldest manuscript that I was telling you about, it's from the Gospel of John, which most scholars would date around the year 90 to 95. And this manuscript, the P52 manuscript I mentioned, is dated somewhere usually between the years 100 and 150. So somewhere between, let's say, 5 and 60 years, 10 to 60 years after the original of the Gospel of John, or the autograph of the Gospel of John, or the initial Gospel of John was written, whatever we might want to call that, that's when this manuscript is. So this is pretty good, especially by ancient standards. Let me show you the closest competitor. That would be the Homeric epics. That would be like Homer's Odyssey and Iliad. For that, we have nearly, as of 2013, we have close to 2,000 manuscripts. And the oldest, it was written about 350 years after the originals. Again, when we compare that to the New Testament, there's no comparison. We have nearly 3 times the amount of manuscripts ancient manuscripts as we have and that's just for the Greek, as we have for the Homeric epics. And the oldest is far closer than what we have for the Homeric epics. Now, I've spent quite a bit of time in Plutarch over the last few years, and when we talk about the manuscripts for Plutarch, it's not even close to what we have for the New Testament. In fact, Plutarch's an important writer because much of what we know of the ancient world we learn from Plutarch. And he wrote just on the heels of the Gospels being written, and he's writing in the same language, Greek. When we're talking about the number of manuscripts that we have from Plutarch's lives, that is the 50 biographies that have survived, we're not talking in terms of thousands. We can't even speak of it in terms of hundreds. We can only speak in terms of dozens. And when it comes to the oldest manuscript we have of Plutarch's lives, and it's not even a complete manuscript, it's dated around the 10th century, perhaps even the 11th century. So let's just call it the 10th century, and with Plutarch, he wrote these, the ones I'd be referring to, around the beginning of the 2nd century. So we're looking at a difference of 800 years at least would be 800 years, is the oldest manuscript we have of Plutarch's Lives that was written after Plutarch actually wrote those. And again, the number of manuscripts we have, we're speaking in terms of dozens. Again, with the New Testament, we're looking at thousands, nearly 6,000 Greek manuscripts, probably 9 to 15 that are written within 150 years of the originals. The oldest within 5, 10 to 60 years after the original. It's just no comparison. We really have a wealth of evidence, of textual evidence when it comes to the New Testament, and in fact, it's better attested than any other collection of literature within the ancient world. Now, this leads us to ask about discrepancies, variants in the text, because when you have so many different manuscripts, you're going to have variances. And in fact, it's estimated that there are, with so many thousands and thousands of manuscripts, we're looking at somewhere between 300 to 400,000 variants in the New Testament. A lot of that's because the scribes weren't careful. Some are direct errors. Some it's because they're paraphrasing. But you have 300 to 400,000 variants, and the New Testament contains roughly 130-some thousand words in the Greek. Variants, there are different kinds. The ones we would be very concerned about would be those that would be viable. In other words, the manuscript evidence would be almost equally as good for one reading as another. We can eliminate a lot of them because the manuscript pedigree for them is quite poor, or the number of manuscript attestation would be quite poor. But if there's a viable reading, it's an alternate reading, that causes some question. And is it meaningful? Would it change the meaning of the text? A lot of times it's just a matter of what we have called a movable nu in Greek. The equivalent in English might be, so today we might say a historian or an historian. And it's changing in the English grammar and how you would pronounce this or how you would write it out. The difference is in N. Do you say a or an? Well, the same kind of phenomena occurred in Greek, and sometimes you'd have that movable nu in there, sometimes not. But it doesn't change the meaning of the text, so it's not a meaningful variant. So is it viable, and is it meaningful? Does it change the meaning of the text? For this, we have very few that would be viable and change the meaning, but I want to show you one. And this comes in 1 John chapter 1, verse 4. One reading, and if you look at your English translation, it will say, "We are writing these things in order that our joy may be full." Other English translations rely on some other manuscript, a viable variant or a viable reading, alternate reading. It says, "We are writing these things in order that your joy may be full." Now, very honestly, the manuscript evidence for both readings is quite good, and it's hard to choose between which one is original. In fact, we really have no idea what the actual or in the initial text, the autograph, actually said. And so this is why the English translations are varied on this. The difference in the Greek term is haimon for our, humon for yours. And if you look carefully, you can see the only difference is one letter. The eta in Greek that looks like the English N, or the upsilon in Greek, which looks like the English U. That changes everything in terms of which word is being used. But the one thing I just want to point out here that's most important is, even though it is a viable reading, even though there is a change in meaning, it really doesn't impact any kind of doctrine or anything else in how we would interpret the letter of 1 John. So the number of variants or readings in the text that we could consider viable and meaningful would amount to about 1/10 of 1%. 1/10 of 1% of all those 300 to 400,000 variants in the Greek New Testament would be viable and meaningful. So we can arrive at, let's say, an initial text of the New Testament, in a sense, that is virtually 99.9% pure. That's pretty amazing. Now, let's follow up with a question that many of you may be asking at this point. If the text that we have of the New Testament is so certain in terms of the Greek and what it may have originally said, then why do we have so many English translations? Why is it that scholars can't agree on what the New Testament actually said when we translate it into English? Well, this is largely because of the purpose of translation. Now, there are various purposes behind the English translations. So, for example, and you've got a lot of different English translations, by the way. You got the King James Version, the New King James Version, New American Standard Bible, New English Translation, the NIV, the NLT, the Holman Christian Standard Bible, the Net Bible, the English Standard Version, Revised Standard Version, American Bible, Amplified Bible, Living Bible, New Jerusalem Bible, and the New World Translation, just to mention a few. So why don't they agree? As I mentioned a moment ago, it's because of the purpose of translation. Now, the different purposes, you have literal translations. This would be the King James Version, the New King James Version, the English Standard Version, the New American Standard Bible. These are regarded as literal translations. Now, many of those watching this video will be familiar with another language, and if you are, you will understand that getting a word-for-word translation is often impossible, and the reason being is because words mean different things in different languages. They have nuanced meanings, or the grammar can be different. So a word-for-word translation can be difficult, but that is the objective of a literal translation, to get as word-for-word as possible. And these are excellent translations. The difference, well, let's say a King James Version and a New American Standard Bible would be the King James Version in terms of the New Testament was based on less than a dozen Greek manuscripts, whereas today we're looking at 5,000, over 5,800 manuscripts. When you're looking at the King James Version, the oldest Greek manuscript that Erasmus had to work with in that critical text upon which the King James Version was based was about 900 years removed from the original, whereas today, somewhere between 5 and 60 years from the original is our oldest text. And again, we've got between 9 and 15 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament that are written within 150 years of the original. So the manuscripts we're working with today are better. We have better manuscript attestation. But you can see that these two translations are very similar. There's really hardly any changes in meaning within the text. Also, the Elizabethan English used in the 17th century, and most people who are reading the King James Version today are reading an edited or updated version, I believe from the 18th century is what they're actually reading. And so, but the ancients in the New Testament, they didn't speak these and thous. That's Elizabethan English. They used a Koine Greek, which was the street language of the day. So that's kind of the difference between those. You also have dynamic translations. This would be like the New International Version and the New Living Translation. These don't focus on word-for-word translation. Their objective is more of a thought-for-thought translation. They understand that sometimes the word-for-word can be awkward, wooden, even difficult to understand. So they want to get that thought-for-thought translation. These are both excellent translations. The difference between the NIV and the NLT is the New Living Translation has limited its vocabulary to 8th grade here in the United States, an 8th grade vocabulary. A great advantage of that would be not only for younger audience, but it would also be good for people whose primary language is not English. We had a couple that we used to live next to from Russia, and we were friends with them. I used to call them our Russian spy neighbor. And they were interested in reading the Bible, and so we got them a New Living Translation. They spoke very good English, but of course, not being their primary language, they're going to have somewhat of a limited vocabulary, and so they could read the New Living Translation with a little more ease than, let's say, they probably could the New International Version. Another kind of translation would be the optimal equivalent translation. This is like a hybrid between the literal and the dynamic translation. The underlining purpose of it would be like a literal translation. But then there is also the dynamic aspect at times when the thought for thought more accurately portrays what's going on than a word for word. These are excellent translations, the Holman Christian Standard Bible and the New English Translation, the Net Bible. And both of these are also extremely valuable when it comes to the notes that it provides at the bottom, textual notes, and especially the New English Translation here. It's just amazing. But both of them are just excellent. In fact, they're some of my two favorite English translations of the Bible. And then you have paraphrases. Paraphrase is more of a thought for thought, but it's almost like a mini commentary. This would be like the Living Bible, which was very popular back in the 1970s. I don't even know that it's around today. Today you've got, by Eugene Peterson, he put the Message. I think paraphrases are good. I wouldn't use it as my primary study Bible. It's good if you want to sit down and read and kind of go through things quickly. But if you really want to meditate and have God speak to you through His Word, I'd go with one of the other kind. But again, the paraphrases are fine to have. I just wouldn't use it as my primary translation. And then finally, you have the New World Translation. And the objective or purpose of this is to deceive the naive. This is the English translation given by the Jehovah's Witnesses. And the JWs, they'll come to your door and they'll tell you that this is scholars agree that this is the most accurate English translation available. But this is nonsense. Listen, I have a PhD in New Testament studies, and I hang around scholars who have PhDs in New Testament studies, and I go to the conferences and I read their books and their journal articles, and I can tell you that nobody talks about the New World Translation, and I've never heard any good or positive comments about it. It really is a poor translation. You can see that they've certainly inserted their theology into it far more than the typical English translation would. It's really questionable whether the people who translated had any good experience in the languages. In fact, years ago, it said that they put out the names, and these guys probably just had 1 year of training in each of the languages, which is really insufficient when you're going to do a professional English translation and make it available to people. It's just really a poor translation. So when the JWs tell me that scholars typically agree that this is the most accurate of the English translations, I like to ask them, well, really, is that so? Can you name me a few? And talk about a look that's like deer caught in the headlights. That's what you get. I said, well, can you just name me one? One major scholar who would say that this is an excellent English translation. And they never have any names because I don't know of any good respected scholar who would make such a claim. The bottom line is that the text of the New Testament we have is quite reliable. It takes us back extremely close to what the initial text, the autographs, would have said. And I think that when we are reading the English translations that we have today, they are based, almost all of them are, none of them are perfect, but almost all of them are based on an extremely accurate and reliable Greek text that lies behind these English translations. And just about all of these English translations are very reliable. We can have a strong degree of confidence that the text of the New Testament we're reading is essentially what was originally written.